Painting a watercolor axolotl is easier than you think, and I'm going to show you exactly how you can do it, no matter your skill level. Hello wonderful people, it's Genevieve, and my goal here on this channel is to teach you all about illustration and design. So if you're new, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the weekly videos, and so that you can join our wonderful creative community. And with that said, grab your drawing tools, and let's get started. Now the first thing we need to do here if we want to have the best watercolor effect is have some sort of a watercolor paper texture within the file. I know a lot of Procreate brush creators do provide pre-textured files, at least I do, and those files are just regular Procreate canvases that you can open and already have texture within them. So you could totally use one of those, whether it is mine or someone else's, that's totally okay. Or if you don't have a pre-textured file, I included a paper texture sample that you can download for free. It is going to be linked in the description below, and it comes with instruction on how you can use that paper texture to create a pre-textured file, so how you can just set it up in your file. So once you have the paper texture, we can start sketching, but before that, if you want to have my illustration as a reference like this in the top corner, the way to do it is just going in the wrench icon menu here at the top, in the canvas menu, activating the reference toggle, which is going to let you import an image. Now if you want to download my illustration along with the very simple color palette that we're going to use in this video, they will both be linked in the description below, and they're totally free as well. Now we're going to start with a sketch, and we're not going to see the sketch in the final result, so for this you can pick really any color of your choice. I like sketching in just a neutral gray. And in this video, I'm always going to suggest a few different brushes that you can use. One option is always going to be a free brush that comes with Procreate and is going to allow you to follow the video along no problem. And then the second brush is going to be a brush from my big brush bundle, especially the watercolor pack. Now these brushes are definitely not essential, but they can help you save some time and get more professional results because they have a lot of texture within the brush as well as color variation, which is going to help you get a more realistic watercolor vibe. So if you want to check those out, again, they're really not essential, but it will be linked in the description below, and there's always a special promo code for the YouTube people. That being said, for the sketch, just like for the color, you can pick whatever brush you want because we're not going to see the sketch in the final result. So if you're working with free brushes that come with Procreate, that could mean using from the sketching pack the HB pencil. Or if you do have the big brush bundle from the watercolor pack, you could pick the coloring pencil. So we're simply going to create a new layer. We're going to make sure this layer is below any texture layer that we might have, and we are going to rename it to Sketch. So here you're just going to quickly sketch the general shape you want your axolotl to have. So just one nice curvy flowy line. And at the front of this line, you're going to draw a circle for the head. And then honestly, the body is pretty simple. All you have to do is start from the shape of the head and then narrow that shape down until you reach the end, which is going to be the tail. And don't worry about making the sketch look good, so don't even think about erasing any stray lines, just leave them there. We're really just building the general shape for now, so it's okay if it's kind of messy and all over the place. So next thing we can do is place the arms and the legs, and for that it could be helpful to just map out little circles on the body, which is essentially where the limbs are going to connect. So it would be, I guess, the shoulders and the hips. I know it's not accurate for this kind of creature, but you kind of understand what I mean. So just placing those along the body, and then from there drawing the arms and the legs. And you can experiment with proportions here, but what I like for this character is having the top of the arm be pretty small, so pretty thin oval, and then the bottom part very thick and round. You could have it the opposite way if you wanted to, but I'm gonna go with this kind of proportion. And then you can just draw a few tiny little nubs for the fingers. And similarly to the human hand, you would have more like regular fingers and then a thumb, so just in a slightly different angle, slightly further away from the other ones. So you're just going to repeat that for the other limbs. One thing to notice though is that the arms are bending kind of forward in this way, and then the limbs in the back, so the legs are bending in the opposite way, so like this. So just keep that in mind, but otherwise it's pretty simple. You just draw 2 ovals per limb and then add a few fingers or toes. And then we're going to add the little things on the head. I have no idea what they're called, but they're super cute. So just 3 on each side, and you can kind of think of them as branches with leaves when you're doing your sketch. It's a similar kind of shape. To add a little floppy detail on the tail, and for that it might be helpful to actually map out the direction of the body and the direction of the head. And what I mean by that is, since we have a curve in the body, we can also imagine that the spine is curving too. So go ahead and map out a curve for the spine, and then on top of that curve is where you can add the little floppy tail detail. Now we're going to drag this line of the spine and we're just going to use it to divide the head into sections. And then if we just add a slightly curved horizontal line, we're going to get what I usually call the plus sign, which is going to help us map out the facial features. Now if you do, like me, have a sketch for the leg at this point, it might be helpful to just loosely erase it so it's a bit less distracting. And then you can just map out the eyes along the horizontal lines. You can also map out a big smile if you want to make it extra cute, maybe 2 tiny nostrils. And if there's any other facial element that you might want to have, go ahead and add it at this stage. Now take all the time you need here to play with your rough sketch and adjust any line that you don't like. I feel like, for example, this curve I'm not super happy with, so since this is a rough sketch, you can really easily just play around with your lines. And you can also use the selection tool here at the top, setting it to freehand, to resize some elements and move them around. For example, I feel like these little details are a little bit too small, so I'm just going to select those, and then with the arrow tool, setting it to uniform, I'm just going to resize them and reposition them, maybe rotate them a bit as well. So really here at this stage, the goal is not to have a clean looking sketch, it's just to have a structure that we like as well as a composition that we like, so that when we move on to the next step, which is going to be a line art, we actually have a really strong base. So feel free to pause the video here if you have more work to do on your rough sketch, otherwise we're going to move on to the next step. We're going to create a line art. So once you have a rough sketch that you like, we're going to again create a line art. Before that, we're just going to lower the opacity of our sketch so it's a little bit less in the way. Now in your case, just lower it as much as you can before you just cannot see anything. I'm going to keep mine a little bit more opaque so you can see it in the video, but again, in your case, as much as you can before it just disappears. And then create a new layer and rename this new layer to line art. Now usually in my watercolor videos I don't really create a line art, but in this case, since our character is essentially white, I think it's a good idea. It's less realistic, it doesn't look as much as watercolor, but at the end of the video I'm going to show you how to blend your line art so that yes, it looks good and it actually helps us see the character from the background, but also so it looks a bit more like watercolor. But for now, we're just going to treat it as regular line art, and we're going to use a darker version of the cream color we're going to use later for the character. So in the color palette, it's this color right here. As you can see, it's kind of a dirty cream color, so pretty gray, but with a little bit of orange or red in it. Now in terms of brushes here, once more, you have a few options depending on what pack you're working with. If you're working with free brushes, you could go back to the sketching pack, if I can find it. And this time, instead of using the 8B pencil, switching to the 6B pencil. Otherwise, if you are working with the watercolor brushes, just stick to the coloring pencil. And here it's pretty simple, there's no right or wrong way to do this, but the idea is to just go over and trace over the lines that you actually want to use to go from a rough sketch to a clean line art. So I'm going to stop talking here to let you focus on doing your line art. I'm going to keep my video going in the background so you can use it as a reference. And then we're going to meet up in the next step. Once we have the line art complete, we're going to start painting the colors. Great, so once you have your line art, we're actually going to start by drawing the background because otherwise we won't see anything of what we're doing since our character is pretty much white. So just go ahead and create a new layer, put it below the line art, and rename it to background. Now for the background, you can obviously use any color of your choice. I want my little guy to look like it's in the water, so I'm going to pick a super nice bright blue, and the color palette, it's this one right here. As you can see, it's pretty much middle of the way in terms of saturation, but it's really super bright, and it's a bit more on the aqua side than the kind of indigo. So that's what I'm going for, but again, you have it in the color palette and you have the X code right here. Now for the brush here, you have a few options as usual. If you're working with free brushes that come with Procreate, you could pick in the airbrushing pack either the soft brush or the medium brush. Probably the soft brush is what I would recommend. And you're going to lower the opacity of this brush probably around 40 or 50%. The exact number doesn't really matter, but what we want is, I'm going to set my brush to quite big. You want to have some overlaps between the strokes. Now my color is really pale, so it's kind of hard to see, but something a little bit like that. If you do have the watercolor brushes though, go ahead and pick the color shifting blotches. Now, no matter which brush you're using, the goal here is just to map out a background so you can draw any kind of shape you want. I have mine be super flowy. You could also color the entire thing. But as you can notice here, the color shifting blotch has a lot of texture like I was telling you, and it has some color variation within the brush. So by just quickly brushing, I already get a bunch of different colors. So if you're working with the free brushes, you're going to have to manually do that, and that's why I had you lower the opacity of your brush so you can go in and just stamp a bunch of different colors. This is going to look terrible because this is not the brush for it, but just stamp a bunch of different stamps, and by doing that you're going to end up overlapping some of the stamps and you're going to get that color variation effect. But again, if you're working with the watercolor brushes, you don't have to worry about that. You can just brush over and the brush is going to add that color variation for you. Now you could stop there, or you could go in with a slightly different blue. So in the color palette, I'm going to pick this one right here. As you can see, it's the same base, just a little bit darker, and just brush that over towards the middle part of the canvas to help the white character pop even more from the background. So as you can see here, I'm getting a lot of color variation because I'm working with brushes that do have color variation. If you're working with free brushes, one more tip that you can use to make your color look a little bit more natural and organic is once you've mapped out everything, going in with your selection tool, again set to freehand, and just drawing a random selection around your background. Making sure that the color fill option is deactivated, you can then go in the feather option and feather your selection probably around 20-30%. And then with your selection activated, going in the adjustment panel here at the top, selecting hue, saturation, and brightness. And then if you just play with those sliders, you're going to add a bit of a gradient or color variation gradient in your shape. Now again, if you're using the watercolor brushes, you don't have to do that because the brush kind of does it itself. So once more, feel free to pause the video here and take all the time you need to work on your background. Otherwise, we're going to start mapping out the little characters. And for that, we're going to create a new layer, making sure that it is below the sketch, below the line art, but above the background. And we're going to rename this layer to Axolotl. Now, if you're familiar with my watercolor videos, you're probably going to notice that these steps are going to be slightly different than what I usually teach. And the reason for that is that I do want to show you a few different techniques that you can use just to give you more tools in your toolbox and to show you that it doesn't always have to be just one way of doing things. So here we're going to start by mapping out the silhouette of the axolotl in one solid brush. So not even a watercolor brush. No matter which brushes you're using, we're all going to go in the airbrushing panel and we're all going to pick the hard brush and we're all going to set it to 100% opacity. And we are all going to pick a dirty cream color. In the color palette, it's this one right here, but as you can see, it's a white with a bit of gray and a little bit of pink or a bit of orange. And with that color and with that brush, we're just going to outline the entire shape and then fill it in to create a solid silhouette. And with that, it is time for the secret password. So if you've watched this far in the video, please go ahead and leave a comment with the word water. Now, if you're new on the channel, you might be a little bit confused with what is the secret password thing. Long story short, it's a game that we play here on the channel, and every single illustration video I hide a secret word for you to find, and that does a few things. The first thing is that it's just really cool because you know me, you see my face in the intro, you hear my voice throughout the entire video, but I have no idea who you are. And whenever you leave a comment, no matter what the comment is, I get to sometimes see your name, sometimes see your face, and it is just really great to see who's part of the creative community that we're building here on this channel. And the second reason is that the secret password does give me a lot of information into how to edit and paste my videos better, which helps me create better tutorials for you, and that's super important to me, creating the best content I can here on this channel. So yeah, just go ahead and leave a comment with the word water, and then we're going to keep going. Now once you have your silhouette, I totally forgot, we can go ahead and just hide the sketch layer. We don't really need it anymore. And we're going to just paint the other color elements that we have. So mostly this kind of pinkish on the tail and on the head. So for that, create a new layer below the line art, but above the basic shape that we have. And rename it to pink. And this is the kind of different technique that I was telling you about. This is a technique I use a lot in my more illustration, like digital illustration videos. Not so much for watercolor, but I do want to show you that you can use it for watercolor as well. So this pink layer, we're going to apply it as a clipping mask on the base shape that we have. So just tapping on the pink layer and then selecting clipping mask in the menu, so that everything we paint on the pink layer is going to stay within the base silhouette that we have. So the pink color we're going to use in the color palette, it's this one right here. You can see it's pretty much of a normal reddish orange, but since we're using watercolor brushes and there is transparency in the brushes, it's going to look more like pink. And for the brushes here, if you're working with free Procreate brushes, go ahead and set your brush to either the hard brush or the medium hard brush. And this time you want your opacity to be lower again, so probably around 40% for this. If you are working with the watercolor brushes though from the big brush bundle, go ahead and set your brush to the dark edges watercolor. In here, what you're going to do is you're going to brush over different shapes, trying to not lift your pencil while you're filling one shape. So for example, you would try and draw the entire tail without lifting your pencil. If you do lift your pencil, it's really not the end of the world. It's going to create an overlap, and we're going to blend the overlaps that we create later anyway. But as much as possible, try not to lift your pencil. Now we're going to do the same thing on the head. Using clipping mask on this pink layer means everything we draw in pink is going to stay within the base shape, so we can just brush over really quickly for the little head details, and it's going to stay within the base shape, at least for the ones that are over the water. The other ones we're going to have to be a bit more precise. And if you want your character to be extra cute on this layer, you can also go ahead and just add two little cheeks. Now, believe it or not, we're almost done. We're just going to add a bit of shadows and then refine the details, blend the line art, and that's pretty much it. So next we're going to do the shadows, and for that, go ahead and create a new layer above the pink layer but below the line art still. Rename this layer to shadows. And we're also going to apply it as a clipping mask so that it stays within the shape of our character. And here we're going to use a blending mode. So just tapping on the N next to the check mark, we're going to select a linear burn from the list. And we're going to lower the opacity around 50% for now, maybe, 40. Let's go with 40 for now, but we can play with it later. Now, without getting into all the details about blending mode, I have a full video about them if you want to check it out. Just know that now this shadow layer is going to blend with the color underneath, which means we can pick one color, paint all the shadows with one color, and the color is going to change depending on what is under. So speaking of color, here we're going to pick the same color we use for the line art, so it's kind of this dirty cream color right here in the color palette. And with the same brush we've been using, so either the hard brush or the medium hard brush with lowered opacity, or the dark edges watercolor, we're going to go over and paint some shadows. Now you can decide where your light source is, that's totally up to you. I'm going to say mine is at the top here, which means all of this right side of my character and the bottom part of my characters are going to be in the shadows. So you can quickly go over and just brush them really loosely. Now you're going to create some overlaps doing that, and that's absolutely what we want. It's probably going to look a little bit weird for now though, but don't worry, in the next step, once we're done mapping out the shadows, we're going to blend them in, and that's really going to be what creates a lot of the watercolor effect. And since we're working with brushes that either have transparency or that are watercolor brushes, if you want a shadow to be even more intense than it is from the first pass, all you have to do is, without even changing your color, overlay your strokes, which is going to make it darker the more strokes you are overlaying. Great, so once you're done mapping out your shadows, we're just going to blend them in a little bit again to reinforce the watercolor effect, because right now this looks super digital. And for that you have two options. As usual, if you're working with the free brushes, you're going to set your smudge tool, so this icon right here, you're going to set that to, in the airbrushing pack, the soft brush. If you do have the watercolor brushes though, you're going to set the paintbrush, so not the smudge tool, really the paintbrush, to, at the bottom of the list, the water blender. And you can think of this step as adding some water on real-life watercolor to blend the different sections together. And if you are working with the water blender, you can do that very easily by just swiping over your line. And as you can see, the brush already has a lot of randomness and is going to make the colors kind of flow around really naturally. But if you're working with the smudge tool, you can see you don't have that randomness. If you just go over the line, it's going to blend it very smoothly. So what I recommend is manually going in and just manually go in and add that randomness by drawing some kind of squiggle instead of going in with a smooth motion. Now again, no matter which tool you're using, the goal here is just to blend in whatever edge doesn't look quite right to reinforce the watercolor vibe. And if you had any overlaps that you didn't like in your pink or red color, this is also the tool you could use to blend them in. So you would just switch to your pink layer and then blend in any overlap. I don't really have any, but I'm going to use the tool on the cheeks because I feel like right now they're a little bit too intense. So I'm just going to blend them in a little bit. So take all the time you need to blend in any weird edge that you might have, and then we're going to jump into the next step, which is going to be adding some details, including splatters, but also recoloring the outlines so that it looks a little bit more like watercolor. So before recoloring the outlines, I think it might be a good idea to add splatters because they're just so fun and I want to make sure that I don't forget. So we're going to do that by creating a new layer, and this layer we're going to actually put it above the line art, making sure that it's below the texture still though. And we're going to rename it to splatters. And just like we did for the shadows, we're going to set the blending mode of the splatter layer to linear burn so that the splatters blend with the colors underneath. And here you can pick whatever color that you use in your piece for your splatters. I'm personally going to pick the blue that we used for the background, so this one right here in the color palette. And in terms of brushes here, I'm not gonna lie to you, the free brushes that come with Procreate for the splatters is really not optimal. It could still work. It's in the spray paint pack, and it's called Splatter, but as you can see, it just doesn't look like watercolor at all. The GK brush is actually a little bit better, but it is quite dense, so you're just going to need to use it very sparingly if you're going with the free brushes. If you are working with the watercolor bundle though, or the watercolor pack, sorry, from the big brush bundle, you can just pick the splatters brush that come with it and then sprinkle a few splatters here and there. It's just a little bit of a detail, I know, but I really like it. I feel like it really makes the piece pop and makes it come together super nicely. Now, if there's any other detail you might want to add on your character, this is the time to do it before we recolor the outlines. I'm going to add a few details on the tail as well as on the body. So just selecting the line art layer and going back to whichever brush you use, so either the 6B pencil or the coloring pencil, going back to the dirty gray that we use, and just drawing any other shape. I like drawing little circles on the skin just to make it look a little bit less flat and boring. So just adding a bit of texture. I'm also going to erase this line here on the tail. I don't know why I had it, so I'm just going to erase it real quick. And then I'm going to add some vertical lines, again, just to add a bit more texture and movement to the tail and break up the shape, because otherwise it's just one solid color, and I'm not a fan of that. From there, we're going to recolor the line art a little bit, and to do that, there's a really easy technique in Procreate. If you select your line art layer and with 2 fingers swipe it towards the right, it's going to activate what is called Alpha Lock. Now, if it doesn't work, you can also activate Alpha Lock from the menu, so just tapping on the layer and selecting Alpha Lock from the list. And what this feature does is now everything we draw on the line art layer is going to stay within the lines that were already there, which means we can just go in with the same color that we used for the pink, but this time it's a brush that doesn't have lowered opacity, so it's going to look darker than what we have. And we can just brush over the lines that are in the red sections to make them match a little bit better and make them look a little bit more natural. And usually we keep the line art super clean and crisp, but in this case you might want to experiment with decreasing the opacity of the line art layer a little bit just to get some blending, again just to help make it look a little bit more like watercolor. So I'm not talking lowering it like, 20%, but maybe in the 80s or 90s could be a cool thing to experiment with. And the very last thing we have to do, you probably guessed it, we're just going to draw the eyes because right now we're losing them in the piece. So we're going to draw them on a new layer above the line art, and you can just rename this layer to eyes. We're going to pick a really nice dark brown, so essentially it's the same color we used for the pink, but just super dark and saturated. And either using, if you're working with the free brushes, the hard brush with the opacity back up to 100% this time, or if you're working with the watercolor brushes, picking the thin intense watercolor, you're just going to go over and color in the eyes. If you enjoyed this video and want more Procreate watercolor tutorials, I highly recommend you check out this playlist because I have a bunch more videos for you. But before you leave, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the weekly videos. Then click on the link right here and I'll meet you there.